I'm Eric Gilbert from the History Department and the grad school, and I'm here on behalf of the RiziCulture program, which is an interdisciplinary rice research program that we've had at ASU this year that will extend into the fall, sort of, next year. And we've had, there are two components of that program. One is that we've had a faculty research seminar going on during this time, where members of the faculty who are working on rice-related issues have gotten together to share their research with each other. The other part of it, and that's what you're seeing tonight, is that we've had a series of speakers come in, people who do rice-related research.
Turn on your mic.
Oh, okay. Thought I was projecting.
We can hear you, but I don't think the back. Can you hear me? Well, they're better ears.
Right, is that louder? The speaker part of it is what we're doing tonight. We've had two previous speakers in the series. One, Peter Koklanis, a historian who talked to us about the origins of the rice industry in Arkansas and Louisiana. And then we had Anna McClung, a plant geneticist from the USDA in Stuttgart, Arkansas, who came to talk to us about the sort of challenges of rice breeding. So we've dealt with the 19th and 20th centuries and 21st centuries so far. Now we're shifting our focus way back to the origins of the initial domestication of rice a very long time ago, and our speaker tonight will tell you more about that. Before we get to all that, I'd like to thank some people who have helped make all of this possible. Laura Umansky, the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, has been instrumental in making all this happen, both in terms of providing organizational help and money. Also in the Dean's office in Humanities and Social Sciences, Debbie Dunning has done extraordinary paperwork and things like that that make all of this possible. In addition to that, we've had financial support from the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Science and Mathematics, Agriculture, Nursing and Health Professions, Communications, Education, and the Office of Research and Technology Transfer. Riceland Foods has also contributed both money and has taken all of our visiting speakers in to see the rice mill and to get to do things like that. And John Sloan, who's both a member of the RiziCulture group, but also a rice farmer, has taken all of our visitors out to experience a rice farm in Arkansas, something that many of them have not had an opportunity to do before. So a number of people and sources of income and help and whatnot have contributed to all of this. Our speaker for tonight is, in a really sort of circuitous way, almost a local. He was born in Rolla, Missouri, which is not where the engineering school in Missouri is. But before long moved to California. Ended up doing his undergraduate work at Yale and then a PhD in archaeology at Cambridge University. He now teaches archaeology at University College London, the Institute of Archaeology at the University College London. He's done field work, and I probably won't get all of the places where he's excavated on the list, but India, China, Morocco, Iraqi Kurdistan, Sudan, Ethiopia. And he's currently involved in a project that's looking at the spread of sort of crops and people across the Indian Ocean in antiquity, before 800 or so. So he's done a great deal of archaeological work in many parts of the world, and his particular focus is archaeobotany. And I sort of learned about him. I'm a historian who works on 19th and 20th century economic history who got interested in rice. And as I started to try to educate myself about rice and the use of archaeology to trace out the movement of crops around the world, I kept running into this name over and over again, Dorian Fuller, and on papers and in conference reports and things like that. And I finally ended up at a conference where I saw on the program that Dorian Fuller was going to be there. And I expected this sort of gray eminence I assumed it was a senior scholar, near retirement, who produced all of this stuff. And I was very surprised when I sort of was eyeing name badges at the conference to realize that, in fact, Dorian Fuller was not all that old, and all was the guy with the Hawaiian shirt over in the corner. So I'm very pleased that he's been able to come here and talk to us, and he's made the sort of full circuit from Rolla to Europe, to China, and then back here to us. And then when he leaves, he's off to Guatemala on Sunday to do another conference. So please join me in welcoming Dorian Fuller.
Thank you. I'm going to just take a minute to try to get this other mic working. Can you hear me okay? Is that working? Is that too loud?
No, that's fine.
It's okay? Okay, so it seems a bit loud. Is that one off? I'll put that down a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the archaeobotany of rice today, and there'll be quite a bit of archaeology, quite a bit of botany, a little bit of ecology, a little bit of ethnography. So hopefully something for everybody. And then towards the end, at the end, I will talk a little bit about greenhouse gases and global warming type things. Hence the title. And these are some of the sites and excavations that I'll touch on. These are both in China. This is in India. So what I'm going to try to do is take you from what we know about wild rice, and this is a map showing the distribution of the wild progenitors, the closest wild relatives of domesticated rice, domesticated Asian rice, distributed in the tropics of Asia, so parts of India, Southeast Asia, southern China. They probably were more widespread in the past, so the red line here shows where we think that the kind of maximum northern limits would have been sort of 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So I'm going to walk you through from that to the domestication of rice, how we understand that process, what the evidence is, what that tells us about what people were doing with rice. And then we'll look a little bit at the spread of rice. And this is another set of maps, which I'll come back to, which is based on a database we've put together for the archaeology of rice in Asia. And you can see it's divided into two. These are the kind of very early finds, and these are the slightly later finds starting from about 4,500 years ago, 2500 BC. And the arrows are sort of my interpretations of how rice spread around Asia. I'll touch on that a little bit at the end, but my focus will really be on the initial transition. The way I'll break up this talk, here's a kind of roadmap so you know where we're going. I'm going to first very briefly tell you what archaeobotany is, because maybe many of you haven't come across it before. Then I'm going to introduce a kind of research project I've been running, which we call the Early Rice Project. And that involves a number of modern studies of traditional rice cultivation and wild rice ecology. So I'll give you some pictures of how sort of primitive rice cultivation techniques that still exist are practiced in parts of India and Southeast Asia. And then we'll look a little bit. Sorry, this is.
I think the other microphone is still on.
I think I turned it off, but.
The little red light is off.
Should I switch to this one and turn this one off?
That's definitely ringing.
Yeah.
Might be better to just hold that in your hand.
Why don't I give that to you? Okay, can you hear me with this one? No, that's much better. Then I will talk about, introduce you to the wild relatives of rice and their ecologies and what that implies about how early human groups who were hunter-gatherers would have encountered and used these things. And then we'll look at how they're transformed into domesticated rice, particularly in eastern China, in the lower Yangtze region, which has our best evidence for that process, although it may have happened in other parts of Asia in addition to that. I'll very briefly touch on India, which seems to be a very different pathway in terms of early use of rice, and then I'll come back to this issue of the spread of wet rice agriculture and methane, and whether there is prehistoric human contribution to global warming that relates to rice agriculture. So that'll be the bit at the end. So we've got a lot to get through. Hopefully we won't be disrupted by the weather or something like that, and we can get through all of it. And hopefully this thing is working. Yeah, so what is archaeobotany? Well, archaeobotany is a branch of archaeology, and as you probably know, archaeology is really about the excavation of past human sites, so sites of human activity, sometimes cemeteries, very often places where people lived, so habitation sites, old ancient village sites, and those are the ones that interest me the most, because archaeobotany is the recovery and the study of the plant remains that are preserved in those sites. And they tend to be preserved in sites where people cook things, essentially, and so you get bits of plants preserved. Ooh, it's moving ahead by itself, interesting. And so that last slide showed an archaeological excavation, and this shows one of our primary techniques for recovering plant remains, which is flotation. And so what we do is the plant remains that are preserved are very small, they're normally carbonized, and you can't really see them when you're digging, or very few of them, but they're in the soil. And so we collect large bags of soil, and essentially you mix it with water, stir, and you pour it through a fine meshed sieve, and we normally use about a mesh size of about a quarter of a millimeter. So everything bigger than a quarter of a millimeter that floats, we catch, and that includes most of the light organics like plant remains. And we can do that through both building flotation machines, or here's a flotation machine that we use on a site in Turkey. Or you can do it manually with lots of willing laborers, students, local helpers, and a bit of elbow grease. And this is, for example, flotation on a site in Sri Lanka, where you can actually, if you have enough people to help you and plenty of water and buckets, you can do it all manually. I have a web address there if you're interested in flotation. I even have a YouTube how-to video, so you can go float your own archaeological site. Right, so what do we recover through flotation? There are two kinds of remains. Through flotation, we recover plant macro remains. Now, as I said, they're small, but they're still macro in that you can see them with the naked eye. So they might be down to a quarter of a millimeter, or they might be a couple millimeters or something, but you can still see them. And that's predominantly material that is carbonized, so it's been charred by close exposure to a fire in the past, which is why human village sites are good, because of course people cook and burn things, and so things get charred. And so we mainly recover things like grains, especially. So soft parts of plants disappear, but the hard parts like grains survive. And so here are examples of carbonized rice grains. Here's a rice grain that's still in the husk, and it's got the spikelet base. And then these little things are actually just that spikelet base, so just the bit where the rice spikelet attaches to the plant. And you can see large quantities of those. That's why we use very fine mesh, because they're quite small. We can also sometimes get waterlogged sites. And so here's examples of spikelet bases and rice husks from a site in China that's almost 5,000 BC. But because the site is essentially at sea level, or even slightly below modern sea level, it's been permanently wet and buried, and so things don't decompose under those circumstances. And so we can sometimes get waterlogged stuff, but that's kind of special circumstances. This charred stuff we get everywhere. Then the other approach we have is to work on plant micro remains, and these are things you really can't see with the naked eye, and in particular phytoliths. And what phytoliths are is silica, which is glass, and plants accumulate silica from the soil and from the groundwater. And as the water evaporates out of the plant, it leaves behind some of that silica. And some plants, especially grasses, deposit that silica in their tissues in ways that is recognizable. And rice is particularly handy in this respect, in that rice produces these very nice diagnostic fan shapes in the leaves, and in its husks it's got these little double-peaked cells. So that means after the plant decomposes or is burnt down to ash, these little bits of glass preserve, and we can recover those again from the archaeological sediment. These are small. These are on the order of 30 microns, which is about the size of a pollen grain. So they're very small. So these are processed in a laboratory, basically by taking small amounts of sediment, a tablespoon or two, and dissolving everything in it except the silica. So you hit it with lots of hydrochloric acid and hydrogen peroxide and destroy everything, but leave this stuff behind. Now, if we have both of these lines of evidence in combination, it's potentially very useful, because if you think about a rice plant, it gets harvested. Of course, all of this is now mechanized today, and I've been seeing some of how it's done using the latest technology, and I'll see more of that at Ricelands tomorrow. But after the rice is harvested, it has to be threshed. You have to winnow off the chaff and the straw and some of the weeds. You've got to break the husk off and winnow some of that out. And that process separates out the grains and the chaff and the straw and the weeds that are infesting the rice. And the seeds can be preserved by being carbonized, and so we can recover the grains and the seeds and the spikelet bases in our flotation samples. And then some of the other bits of the rice plant and other plants growing with it might be preserved in the phytolith record. So we can put both of these two together and get a sort of more complete picture of both the human activities involved with processing rice and how the rice was grown. Okay, so that's my short introduction to what archaeobotany is. And the next thing is to look at our use of modern analog studies and what I mean by that. And this is really, it's a kind of ethnographic study, ethnoarchaeology, but we're really focused on the sort of ecology. We're partly focused on what people do with the rice, but we're focused on the ecology of the rice, which is a product of how people cultivate it. And so this, for example, is a picture of a rice harvest in the hills of northern Orissa, which is a state in eastern India, which has lots of minority peoples in India. So this is a tribal group called the Santals, who speak an obscure language in the Munda language family, rather than Hindi and things like that. And so this is upland rice, totally unirrigated, totally grown on rainfall. And you can see it's being harvested by a sort of large extended communal group. In the background here, you've got a couple of cattle which are threshing the rice. So the rice is, in this case, threshed by cattle. And the guy with the umbrella is probably supervising it or something. Anyways, and so in these sort of contexts, we can see both how human activities might lead to certain plants coming into the archaeological record. And then we can also look at what's growing in this field and see how that differs from other methods of rice cultivation. So we've really been interested in the last few years in trying to document how the weeds that grow with rice reflect different ways in which it's cultivated. And that's been one of the strands of the focus of this early rice project. So a short slide on what our sort of aims in this project have been, and some acknowledgements of our funders. I've had funding from the Natural Environment Research Council of the British government, which is kind of like NSF, except in Britain NSF is subdivided into different research councils, so this is one of the sort of branches of that. And we had a 3-year grant which just finished, and we're just starting another 3-year grant in May, and that funds postdocs and field work and lab expenses and so forth. And so what we've been trying to do is develop really a clear methodology for determining how rice was cultivated. So the different ecosystems of rice. Was it deeply irrigated? Was it rain-fed? Was it somewhere in between? Was it upland, lowland, and so forth? But the rice grains themselves are not going to tell us that. We need to look at the associated weed flora. And to do that, we need better modern data on weeds. And also to use that archaeologically, we need to find places where they're cultivating rice without modern methods. So no herbicides and no pesticides and no chemical fertilizers, because all of those things are going to change the weed flora. And so those places are becoming increasingly scarce in the world. So it's also interesting to go and document these places while they still exist. But in many parts of Southeast Asia and India, you can still find cultivation that uses none of these modern techniques. And so we've been then looking at both the weeds that grow there and then also collecting soil samples for phytoliths so that we can look at the phytolith, the sort of statistics of the plant silica assemblage in different environments to see how those vary. So even if we can't tell which plant every phytolith came from, we can still get statistical patterns that reflect the ecology. And in addition to studying cultivated rice, we've been looking at wild rices as well, because of course wild rice doesn't grow alone, it grows with other species, and many of those species have become weeds of cultivation, and some of them haven't. And then we're trying to apply that archaeologically. And we work with partners in various Chinese institutions, some of which are listed here, and Deccan College in India. We've done some work in Sri Lanka with the Postgraduate Institute of Archaeological Research in Colombo, and so forth. Okay. So the aim of these analog studies is to get at how was rice cultivated. And depending on where you are, there's very different systems in which you cultivate rice. And this is a schematic diagram that kind of shows the range from what we call upland rice or dry rice to the various kinds of wet rice. So it has to do with how much water there is. And there are very deep water rices. I mean, I've seen rice in Thailand growing in more than 2 meters of water, even up to 3 meters of water. That's like 9 feet of water. And then, you know, those rice plants are then 10 feet tall, things like that. They're not as productive, those ones, but you can co-manage those with fish. So in parts of southern China and Cambodia and Thailand, they are also not just cultivating the rice, but they're cultivating carp, which is then a protein source that people eat and so forth. So there's a wide spectrum of rices, but in broad terms we divide them into wet rice and dry rice. It tends to be the case that with more water, well, until you get the sort of middle depths here, you get higher yields of grain. But it's also the case that you tend to get more methane production, and we'll come back to that issue a little bit later. Now, just although I'll kind of show you some of the evidence for this, what we think is happening is the earliest rice in India is really at the dry end of the spectrum. The earliest rice in China is at the wet end of the spectrum, and Southeast Asia is at the drier end of the spectrum as well. And so we have different traditions early on in rice cultivation. Over time, all of these different traditions are used everywhere. So you can find dry and wet rice in India, and dry and wet rice in Thailand, and dry and wet rice in China. But at the beginning, they start off in different places. And so for our analog assemblages, I mean, I don't know how easy it is to see this map, but there's a bunch of white dots here. This is Orissa in eastern India, a few in western India in the mountains in the western Ghats, and then a few in sort of southern Thailand, a bunch in northern Thailand, and in Laos, and a very few in China. These are our analog sites, and some of this data is still being analyzed, and some of them are wild rice and some are cultivated rice. But what we've tried to do is find a real spectrum and a range of these things. So just to put some pictures and give some examples, so these are our wild rice collection localities. So some in Guangxi in South China, and lots in India, a little bit in Thailand. I'll look at these in a minute more, and then we have lots of, we're going to look at this a bit more. So within the wild rices, there's really two main types, and traditionally they're divided into two different species. There's an annual, which is the one shown here on this side, and essentially it grows in monsoon seasonal puddles. So the monsoon rains come, and in places where they have heavy monsoons, they dump 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, so 100 centimeters, which is what I'm trying to do math in my head. I mean, that's, what is that, 30 inches or something? No, it must be more than that. Anyways, you get quite a lot of rain. You get these seasonal puddles in the monsoon season, and then the rice sprouts up, and it's a low-growing, spreading rice. You see it growing in these puddles. This is after it's starting to shed its seed, and you can see all the rice spikelets there in the mud. And then this is the perennial rice, or Rhiza rufipogon, and it grows in permanent water. So it's a perennial, and it has to have its roots always wet, and it normally grows in shallow streams and ponds that are perennial. And so you can see it's quite tall there. There's a colleague of mine out there. So we have these two different ecologies. This actually shows that there's a third species of rice here, Rhiza officinalis, which is a sort of little rice that grows on the edge of rufipogon. Sometimes it grows even in the forest. Here's another example of rufipogon where you've got permanent, this shows it's a perennial and permanent water. You've got all these nice lily pads. You have things like algae, so sort of permanent water. And in this you have these permanent rice plants. Now one of the challenges if you were a hunter-gatherer and you wanted to use perennial wild rice is because it's a perennial, it doesn't produce that many seeds because it's putting its effort into growing more shoots and more roots and more leaves. And so its seed production is relatively low. However, when there's a drought and it becomes water stressed, it produces more seeds. And that's a very important component of our story, which I'll come on to, because we think that this perennial rice is the ancestor of the early cultivated rices in China. Now, the annual rice, it has about a 4 to 5 month growing season, maybe 6 months maximum, and then it dies, and its only reproduction is in the grain. So it produces large quantities of grains. And so we also did, and this was really directed by one of my PhD students, although I had a go as well. She's doing all the numbers. We had a go at trying to do some experimental harvesting of wild annual rice here, and with some of my Indian colleagues, and even me, we all had a go, partly to see how much you could get, how long it would take to get enough to feed a family, and also the state of it to compare with our archaeological stuff. Now there's a couple, so we did it in a way that you might do it if you were not a farmer. If you were a hunter-gatherer, you take a basket, and there's another basket, sort of like a plate, and you just kind of paddle it along. And because wild rice naturally sheds its seeds, they don't stay on the plant when they're mature, that paddling process just sort of sweeps them up and they fall into the basket. So you can see this was one of our local helpers. He was far more efficient than the rest of us. You can see there's variation in terms of the weight that people harvested. This was in 5 minutes. How much weight of rice can you harvest in 5 minutes in a wild rice stand? But anyways, if you extrapolate up from that, the yields are reasonably good compared to similar studies that have been done on wild wheat and other wild foods and some ethnographic cases. So you could certainly, if you're a hunter-gatherer, this would be a useful resource in terms of pretty good returns for effort. One of the interesting things we found, however, was that if you see at this end, there's quite a lot of spikelets where the grain is not formed yet, that are immature. And this is by count, the immature ones by weight, and by count, the immature ones in blue. The reason that's significant is a few years ago I got into some debates with other colleagues where I started to, it occurred to me that if you were a hunter-gatherer, and you see this in relation to other plants, your worry is losing grain. And so if grain falls off the plant as it matures, you lose it. That means if you're going to go and harvest it as a hunter-gatherer, you need to harvest it early while some of the grain is still immature. And therefore you expect on your early sites, your hunter-gatherer sites, to get a large proportion of immature grains. And immature grains have a slightly different shape, and their spikelet bases have a different morphology. And so these are things we can look for archaeologically, which then forces us to reinterpret some of these early assemblages in China. And this was my prediction from 2007 on the kind of proportions of immature to mature grains that you might expect in these early harvests. And they're not bad, they're not far off from what we're actually getting in an experimental case, which is kind of nice. Okay, so what about traditional cultivation methods? So I'll show you a few of those. So again, it's very different from what you'll see in the landscape around you here in Arkansas, so I think it's probably worth having a look at that. And so these are some of our analog sites where we studied rice. I mean, this one may surprise some of you. That hill is sort of this steep. It's extremely steep. And this is in the Karen people, a tribal minority in northern Thailand. And they practice slash and burn agriculture. So they cut down trees and they burn off the vegetation, and then they broadcast sow rice on these steep hillsides. So this is a young rice crop coming up. And they leave some other shrubby things, and they plant some other crops in there. And we see this kind of sort of upland rice, and there's no irrigation, of course. It's heavy rainfall, so it's all done by rain. Obviously, you couldn't combine harvest on a slope like that. You'd have to do it by hand. So, and this is a very similar system in upland Laos. And this shows how in many of these systems, rice is the dominant part of a much more mixed agricultural system. So in here, you've got a young banana tree coming up. Here's a kind of a gourd, a kind of bitter melon, I think, in the gourd family. Over here is not sure how easily you can see it. That's a cassava plant. You can see a lot of the yellow stuff here is rice, which has just been harvested. And then all the green stuff is the other stuff that's intercropped with the rice that will continue to grow over the next bit. So you get these very mixed systems. Obviously, the weed flora that's going to grow in there is going to look very different than what you get in a wet rice paddy field. But we also looked at wet fields. And this is back in India in northern Orissa. amongst another tribal group called the Munda, in which it's basically a forest area, and they do quite a bit of hunting, and they keep some pigs, and they grow some taro and yams, and they cultivate rice, but it's really low effort rice, low intensity rice. And in this case, this is a kind of stream valley that runs through a woodland area, and they've simply sown the rice into the stream bottom. It's very uneven. This is my postdoc's foot, and she's comparing her shoe size here to an elephant footprint. So the wild elephants will trample through the forest and trample over the rice fields, and it means it's kind of pitted and it's muddy and pitted, but you can also see that there's a lot of plant diversity in there. It's not just rice. There's lots of species growing in there. So this is, in a sense, a very simple, low-intensity form of cultivation, and the kind of things that we think are probably going on quite early on. And nearby, another field of the same village, and this was one that even shocked me when I first saw it. This is the same field from two ends. This is one end out near the forest edge, and here you can see the ground is quite dry now. These rice plants are a foot high. They're 15 centimeters, something like that, extremely short. The other end of the rice, you can see the water out here, is out in this stream, and this stream has been, ends in a kind of little pond. So they're out in the pond edge, and this is that edge here. And here the rice stops out here where you've got these water lilies and lily pads. If you walk out here, the water is up to my chest, and then the rice plants are another couple feet above my head. And that's a single rice crop that they've planted at one time. And again, it's very low intensity. So they don't know how much water they're going to get, how much rainfall there's going to be, but they've simply sown the rice sort of along the edge of this pond. Where it's too deep, of course, the rice never establishes. And then as the rains come, it gets deeper and deeper, and the rice continues to grow. So in the deep water, the rice gets very, very tall indeed. In the very dry areas, the rice is going to have almost no yield. It's extremely short. But in between, you've got a gradient from dry to wet. And in the middle, they're going to get better yield. And we were able to do transects across this, and of course, the associated weed flora changes completely from being aquatic species to dryland species. So if you go somewhere in the middle, you find your different species. I've labeled some of them here. You get wild grasses like paspalum and Isocne globosa. That's this one here. This little blue flowers, Cyanotus axillaris, and many of these species, of course, are, at least in Asia, well-known and problematic weeds. Although I suspect our modern herbicides will deal with these. But anyways, in traditional agriculture, they're a problem, but for the archaeobotanists, they're a gift, because they allow us then to interpret the ecology of ancient rice fields by their presence. This is some examples of very, very deep water rice. This is a deep water cultivar near Bangkok, which again the underwater part is about 2 meters, and then this is the overwater part. So there are some extremely deep water rices in some parts of the world. This is your more typical rice in the plains of India, which is a lowland rain-fed rice. So you get heavy rain, and after that rain there's standing water, and then it dries up, and here it is being harvested. And we're kind of chatting to one of the farmers about it. Now just to show you a bit of traditional harvest. So the rice is harvested, it's bundled into sheaves, as was true of wheat and barley harvests in Britain or America 200 years ago or 150 years ago. Those are then allowed to sit in the sun and dry. And in that sheave, if you start to dissect it, there's also lots of weeds, so we can look at that sort of thing. And then it's processed by threshing. There's lots of different traditional threshing methods. One of the most popular in India is threshing with cattle. So here's cattle trampling the rice. But this is a photo from a Japanese colleague who's been up to Bhutan here that's being threshed by people trampling it. And then this is also one of somebody holding the rice and simply beating bundles of rice against the board, and that breaks the spikelets off. So there's lots of different traditional methods for processing rice that you can observe around Asia. What you see more often in India today, so this is also in Orissa, is this. Guess how they're threshing the rice here? Anyone? the easiest way now to thresh rice is to wait for the trucks to pass by, and they trample it for you. Trucks and passing buses and cars are much less stubborn than cattle. And so you'll get people who are near paved roads. If you're near a paved road, you'll take your rice harvest, park yourself on the edge of the road. You'll take bundles of it out and sit it in the road and let passing traffic break it down for you. And then these guys are raking it up to sort of separate out some of the impurities and so forth. Okay, so anyways, from this kind of data, we can start to get a picture of how those different weed taxa. I'm not going to go through the details on this table, but this just compares upland, rain-fed, lowland, irrigated, and deep water rices with different weed taxa which are present. And so we can look at the co-occurrence of a species assemblage and potentially reconstruct how it's grown. And just some more examples of rice with some of its associates, another deep water one. Now, phytoliths I've already mentioned are plant silica. So I have a postdoc who specializes in phytoliths, and these are examples of some of the phytoliths that have come out of different weeds. So we're able to collect the weed species, take them back to the laboratory, burn them down to ash, and then we can get the phytoliths out, and that will allow us to recognize some of those weeds archaeologically. So that's some examples of those. But then we're also taking the soil samples to look at the ecological sort of indicator assemblage for each different kind of rice system. And using some of the modern rices, this was a sort of pilot study. We have a lot more data now. And doing multivariate statistics, and I won't go through all the details, but this is a correspondence analysis. The rice clusters, the different colors are individual field case studies, but they also cluster by group. So you get your upland, your higher rainfall upland rices here, your lower rainfall rain-fed rices here, your deep water and irrigated rices in this corner. And so they pull out in terms of the phytolith assemblage. So this shows us that there's patterning in the data in the phytoliths associated with rice, which are showing us ecological patterns, and we can potentially employ this archaeologically, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. Okay, now I'm going to move into the archaeology of rice. So that's it for the sort of analog bit. This is back to our wild rice distribution map, and the area I'm really going to focus on today, which has our best data, is the lower Yangtze Valley. So this area here, which for those of you who so this obviously is China. Here's the Yangtze River, so it's south of the Yangtze, on the south edge of the Yangtze River Delta. Just above this circle, or at the edge of the China here, is Shanghai. So we're just to the south and west of Shanghai, where we're going to look at. Now these other areas and circles are places that also have early rice evidence in China. The evidence is not as good. There haven't been as many systematic studies. And they could all be cultivating early rice in parallel and domesticating rice sort of in parallel. But we're going to focus on this area because that's where we have the best data. And then I'll touch on this area in the middle Ganges River Valley in India a little bit at the end. That's another candidate region for rice domestication. Now, as I already talked about, these two ecologies of wild rice. There's a perennial that grows in permanent water, and there's a seasonally wet annual. And these seem to have led to, both have led into domesticated rice in sort of separate pathways. And we know that from modern genetic studies. So this is from an older Japanese and Chinese study from 2003, 2004. If you look at more recent studies, you'll find very similar patterns. And what this shows you is that your Japonica rices, which are those that dominate East Asia, and your American long grains and medium grains are also Japonica rices originally. So they genetically come out of this group. They cluster with wild rices found today mainly in southernmost China. And then here's other perennial wild rices from Southeast Asia. And then the indica rices and some Japonicas cluster mainly with wild rices, these crosses, which are the annual wild rices in India and Burma and some of Southeast Asia. And so it suggests that there are these two very separate groups of domesticated rices. And that's sort of been known for a while. Now, as we've gotten more genetic data, there's some complicating factors in that. So despite the fact that all these whole sort of genome and genetic diversity studies suggest separate origins for indica and japonica rice, when you look at some of the actual mutations the genes that characterize domesticated rice and separate it from wild rice, so things that actually function to make domesticated rice different from its wild ancestor. These are some of the genes by the names that they're known to geneticists. And some of these are quite important. So this one, SH4, seems to be universal in all domesticated rices and absent from the wild. And it relates to seed dispersal. These are very often single mutations, and they seem to be shared by both indica and japonica. So we have a paradox. And what that paradox implies is that there's been hybridization between the indica and japonica lineages since the beginnings of agriculture. And so that some of these adaptations that make rice a good crop, a domesticated crop, have been shared through hybridization processes. Now this is also true of a number of genes which I would call aesthetic genes or cultural genes that are not universal but are quite widespread, and they tend to be single mutations. And one of them which is very important for much modern rice cultivation is this what's known as the RC mutation, which makes rice white. As any farmer will know, all wild rices and weedy rices are red. And that's true of other species in the genus. It's 100% wild rices are red. But so are some cultivated rices. So some of the primitive domesticated rices are also red. And you'll find red cultivated rices in India. They're very popular in Sri Lanka. They'll fetch higher money in Sri Lanka for a red rice than a white rice, for example. So there's a certain amount of cultural preference there. And of course, in some parts of China and Southeast Asia, you have black rices, which are actually a kind of dark purple, which is a different mutation. So rather from red to white, from red to dark purple, to black. But the RC mutation is shared between indica and japonica. So it evolved once and then it spread by hybridization. So that means culturally people have come into contact, they've exchanged rices, and those rices have then exchanged genetic material. And so even though we have separate beginnings of cultivation, those different lineages of cultivation have subsequently in history and early in history come together and shared genetic adaptations that make them better crops. So this is a kind of cartoon of how I think rice evolves. And the real point of this is it tells us the importance of having multiple lines of evidence. So sometimes geneticists will take modern varieties of rice, modern landrace data, and they'll say, well, we can do the genetics and we can infer everything about the history of rice. But the problem is, of course, they're only looking at the modern time plane, and a lot of the diversification of indicas and japonicas is recent. It won't necessarily, it's not like modern plant breeding, but it's recent. Farmers have been improving and breeding rice by traditional methods in China and India for a couple thousand years or 3,000 years. So a lot of this is relatively recent diversification, and a lot of that's in the last few hundred years. And in the past, there are lots of varieties of rice that maybe are no longer grown and have gone extinct. And so this kind of shows our red domesticated rices, which we have today, and we must imagine that there's hybridizations between early indicas and japonicas, because these have taken these domestication genes that arose in japonica in China and transferred them into the rices that were first cultivated in India. And so it's a much more complicated story. And it means if you want to understand the history of rice, we need to not just look at the modern genetic diversity, but we need to go back into the past and infer what we can archaeologically about its history, and sometime in the not too distant future, work on ancient DNA from some of these archaeological rices. Okay, so what's happened, I'll come back to India a little bit at the end, but essentially to put out there what I think is happening is in India, because they're focusing on the annual wild rice, which is a very prolific grain producer, there's very little incentive to actually domesticate the plant and change it. And so you have what I would call a non-domestication system of management. We might call it cultivation. They're probably removing competing vegetation by burning it off. They may even be planting the seeds, but they're harvesting it by things like paddling stuff into a basket, which do not select for any genetic change on the part of the early indica rices. So the kind of proto-indica cultivation doesn't lead to many genetic changes. The difference in China is that they're trying to take a perennial wetland rice, which is a very poor grain producer, and turn it into an annual crop. And to do that, you have to actually change the plant. It has to be selected to undergo genetic changes. And so a lot of our key genetic changes have to do with plant growth architecture, non-shattering, grain size, how the panicle holds together, and also pollination. Wild rices like to cross-pollinate. Domesticated rices tend to self-pollinate. They tend to pollinate themselves. So a number of these genetic changes have to take place, and they all seem to arise in this transition from a perennial wild rice in the Yangtze Valley in South China to a domesticated japonica. So we have two different pathways into early rice cultivation, and one of which is much more, requires a lot more sort of intensive labor and management, but then it leads to genetic changes, which in the long run are very important. Okay, so what are those genetic changes and how can we see them archaeologically? Is perhaps the next question. So here's a crude comparison of wild rice and domesticated rice. This is the perennial Rhizorufi pogon. One of the biggest issues is that wild rice, like all wild plants, wants to shed its seed. And so when the seed is mature, it comes off. And here's a spike that's just popping off this rice panicle, and you can see in these other ones a lot of the grains have already gone because they will have fallen into the water and the mud and so forth. And to help it fall off and disperse, it's got a very long awn like this, and obviously here's the skinny red grain. So grains tend to change in size. They tend to lose or reduce the awn, and then very importantly they lose the shattering. So if you compare the wild rice, which is where the grains are falling off, to a domesticated rice, of course, as the rice matures, the grains get heavy and they droop, but they don't fall off the plant. They stay on the plant until the farmer harvests them. And that's a very useful adaptation from the point of view of a farmer. If you want to come through and harvest a field with a sickle and make sure you don't lose any of your grain, you want a mutation that keeps the grains on the plant. So that's a really key domestication trait, and the one that we can track archaeologically. And so this, again, could contrast that trait between the wild rice that's shattering. Very useful if you want to go through and harvest with a basket. But if you want to use a sickle or something and really get efficient returns, you need to be able to harvest it. You need to keep the grains on the plant. So I'm now going to look at, start by looking at an archaeological site called Tenlo Shan, which is here at this arrow. Here's Shanghai is just up here on this kind of nose. So it's just south of Shanghai. It's near the city of Hangzhou, Tenlo Shan here, and it dates back to about 5000 BC, or between 5000 and 4300. There's a sequence of layers there. Now Tenlo Shan is a site where we have exceptional preservation. So it was discovered in 2003 when a farmer was digging foundations for a new barn, and then a rescue archaeology project started, and then eventually the county government bought the site, and they've now erected a dome over the site, and it's a sort of site museum. And because it's got this exceptional waterlogged preservation, you can actually see all these stumps here. Those are posts from houses. So those are posts from wooden timber houses that were built 6,500 years ago. And because the foundations of those houses go into these layers of clay, which are permanently waterlogged and have been buried, they're preserved. And so you can actually see these lines of posts. And in those layers, you have exceptional plant preservation. So all the waste and garbage that people disposed is also preserved. So we have exceptional preservation there. This is a view from the top. So you see these lines of posts, fallen timbers. It's sometimes hard to interpret where the structures are, but you can tell that there's all these built structures. They have mortar and tenon joints where the wood fits together and so forth. The other thing you'll notice here, which you see some of these here and here, is you get these storage pits. And one of the ways in which they stored a lot of food in those days was storage pits. Because of the good preservation, you also get preserved tools. And this is a spade, so like a shovel, made out of wood. And here's possibly another kind of shovel or spade or pick or hoe or something made out of bone, made out of the shoulder blade of a wild buffalo. But then we get these storage pits, and in many of these pits, what you find in the bottom of the pits is not rice, but acorns. And pit after pit is full of acorns. We started trying to count them all, and we stopped at about 30,000 One pit had 30,000, it was a small pit, and then we figured, well, we're not going to count every single pit. We'll just sort of say, well, there's maybe 30,000 acorns in a pit or something like that. And you know, it takes a long time to count all those things, so we stopped after a few pits. But anyways, so they're collecting acorns by the tens of thousands, and they're storing them in pits. We also get lenses of waste of acorn shell, so they're clearly deshelling the acorn and using it as a carbohydrate source. And many of you will know that a lot of Native American groups collected acorns, especially in California, and detoxified them and used them as a carbohydrate source. So they're a very good wild food source if you're in an environment that has lots of oaks and your population isn't too high, and so forth. So they're using lots of acorns. They're also using lots of aquatic nuts. They're gathering these things which are called water chestnuts, trepa, which grow in ponds. Here's one being a modern one being harvested, and something called the foxnut. I mean, I'm not sure who calls it the foxnut, because these things only occur in Asia. You won't see them anywhere else. The Chinese call them qin shi. It produces a seed which is also very starchy, and you'll still find them in Shanghai traditional markets and things, and they use them to make cakes and so forth. That's a very starchy seed. So they're gathering large quantities of these, and then we also have large quantities of rice. So as we started to analyze this site, what we found is there's basically 4 species that dominate all the samples: acorns, and these 2 aquatic nuts, and rice. And these are different ways of comparing those in terms of items per liter, so per liter of soil. And for archaeobotanists, these are incredibly high densities. On a typical site with only charred material, you're looking at 5 or 6 or maybe 10 seeds per liter of soil. On a really rich site, you might have 50 or 60, but here we're looking at, you know, thousands and so forth per liter of soil. So it's a very rich site indeed. And so it suggests that we have 4 kind of co-staples, 3 of which are definitely wild, the 4th of which is rice. And we'll come on to it, but it's rice in the early stages of cultivation. In addition, they're gathering lots of other wild foods. So my focus is rice, but to understand that, you have to put it into a context. They're gathering wild blackberries and wild melons and wild grapes, and they're probably cultivating bottle gourds. But anyway, so there's a range of wild things that they're gathering. Here's some more of them: wild kiwi fruits and wild peaches and so forth. So they're living in a rich subtropical environment where there's lots to gather. But amongst their food remains, one of the top 3 is, in every sample, is rice. And amongst the rice remains, what we have lots of, in particular, are the spikelet bases. So if we look at a spikelet of rice, where it attaches to the plant, this little bit just at the base, which is where it attaches, is what I mean by the spikelet base. And that's very important, because that's where one of the key changes is between wild and domesticated rice. In wild rice, when the grain is mature, the spikelet will come off by forming a nice, smooth, round abscission scar. So you get a nice, smooth, round, flat scar. This is a scanning electron microscope image of an archaeological one. Here's a modern one, and here's a waterlogged archaeological one. In a domesticated rice, it has to be threshed. It doesn't come off, so it has to be broken off by threshing, by human labor. And so you get a scooped out, broken, uneven scar. That's a modern one. And here's some archaeological ones from Tenlo Shan. And then we also have ones that are probably green harvested, so they weren't quite mature, the abscission scar hadn't formed, and in those cases they tend to break with a little stalk sticking out. And that's a modern one that I harvested green as an example. We have lots of those now from our harvest experiments, and these are some archaeological ones. So actually we get all 3 types at Tenlo Shan. And in an initial study that I finished in 2006, I guess amongst 27,000 seeds and things that I counted, I had about 1/10 were spikelet bases, so 2,600, which is a pretty good sample size for archaeobotany. And so for each sample, we could look at each individual sample from each layer and separate out domesticated types, wild types, and immature types. And it looks something like this, in which it's roughly 1/3 of each, but there's slightly more wild. Especially, this is the lowest levels of the site, but then the later levels of the site, we have noticeably more of these black ones, of these domesticated ones. Now we can turn those statistics into an average and a range, so a mean and a standard deviation for each sort of phase of the site. And when we do that, the data looks like this. This is the kind of average domesticated, and it's increasing over time. And the average wild is decreasing over time. such that in the lower levels there's more wild rice than domesticated, and in the upper levels there's more domesticated than wild rice, and the difference is statistically significant. There's also a decline, which is maybe less significant statistically, in the immature types of rice. And so these are the three sort of phases of that site, and we're seeing this tipping point, this switch from being more majority wild to just a slight majority domesticated. This is a much later site, so if we take a site that's 2000 BC from the region, we get something like 70% domesticated. And you always have a small percentage of wild because that's the weedy rice. That's like the red rice you have to deal with here. That's always there in the background. So we always have some weedy rice. Right, so what that means is that we're dealing with a situation which is very much transitional. These people are gathering things from the forest, they're gathering things from the wetlands. In the bone record, it's really dominated by fish, so they're doing lots of fishing. So they're using these wetland nuts and fish. They're probably still gathering some wild rice, but then what we think they're doing is they're cultivating basically the edges of the wetland, and they're creating some domesticated rice. So these are your early domesticated rice, which are starting to be non-shattering, but I've still shown them as kind of spreading. They probably still have the architecture of wild rice, but they're starting to change. So it's very much a transitional site. It's right in the middle between fully wild and fully domesticated. And it allows us to get a sense of how fast the rice is changing. How fast are those genetic mutations accumulating? You know, here's a kind of 300-year period, 400-year period, so we can extrapolate that. If it's a constant rate, that means the domestication process takes something like 2,500, 3,000 years. So that's a long period of transition. Okay. We actually now have a much bigger data set from sites around the region. I haven't, you know, something, I mean, you can see some of these sites have 8,000 spikelet bases, 1,400, 3,000. We now have, you know, tens of thousands of these from this region, mostly for the later periods. And what we see here's Tenlo Shan, these three dots here. So this is the increase in domesticated, the decrease in wild. Sorry, the decrease in wild here, the increase in domesticated. And then these later sites are all up here in the very high percentages of domesticated, low percentages of wild and immature. And so Tenlo Shan is catching this sort of tipping point, and then by about 4000 BC, that aspect of domestication is finished. And so we're getting the end of that process quite clearly. This is if you just do a ratio of domesticated to wild, showing that here you have the dominance of wild, and then after that it's domesticated. Now, the other things we can look at are things like, we know that wild rice is very thin grains, thin grains, whereas they get fatter, both thicker and wider with domestication. So if we compare modern domesticates, I mean, there's long grain rices and short grain rices, of course, you guys all know that, but all of our domesticated rices are thicker. So they have a bigger grain, they're thicker than the wild.